In this module, we shall discuss the government budget constraint, the role, the limits and the effects of government or public debt have long been at the core of fiscal policy debate. Public debt affects the allocation and distribution of resources and the stabilization functions of the government. It reflects decisions taken by previous generations and it constrains those of the future generations. There are many negative opinions about the fiscal deficits and the government debt. Ricardo says that the debt is one of the most terrible scourges which was ever invented to afflict a nation. He says that through debt, people are actually blinded of the real situation if they are not able to foresee the future changes in taxes. Similarly, Smith also argued that government borrowings would deprive society of resources which could be invested more productively. He also noted that beyond a certain threshold, debt inevitably leads to national bankruptcy. However, classical economists were also well aware of the necessity of allowing borrowing in certain circumstances and of its usefulness in others. Building on such awareness, gradually the idea gained consensus that the public debt need not be repaid as it can be refunded and that the problem of the debt burden is a problem of an expanding national income. This gave birth to the idea of constrained fiscal deficit and government debt. Hence, in the present module, we shall first discuss about the government budget constraint, then we shall analyze the intertemporal budget constraint, the fiscal deficit and government debt. An attempt has also been made to examine the fiscal sustainability in finite and infinite time horizon. Learning outcomes. After studying this module, you shall be able to discuss about the government budget constraint, explore the relationship between intertemporal budget constraint, fiscal deficit and government debt, understand fiscal sustainability in infinite time horizon, to understand the fiscal sustainability in finite time horizon. First, we shall discuss the government budget constraint. Like a household, the government too has a budget constraint and it cannot spend endlessly beyond its resources. In simple terms, the budget constraint of government requires that the present value of its purchases must be less than or equal to its initial wealth plus the present value of the tax receipts. This can be represented in the following way. The integral of t is equal to 0 to infinity e raised to power minus rt into gt into dt is less than equal to minus d0 plus the integral of t is equal to 0 to infinity e raised to power minus rt into tt into dt. Here gt indicates government purchases, tt government revenue, that is taxes at time t, d0 is the initial real debt outstanding, rt is equal to the integral of tau is equal to 0 to t into r tau into d tau, where r tau is the real interest rate at time tau. Here d0 represents debt rather than wealth, therefore we have a negative sign before it. In this way, debt is a negative wealth. In case of households, we assume that the limit to the present value of wealth cannot be negative. In case of government, since we have seen that the debt is a negative wealth, we can say that the budget constraint implies that the limit to the present value of the debt cannot be positive, that is, limit s tends to infinity e raised to power minus rs into ds must be less than equal to 0. The budget constraint is satisfied in both the cases. First, if the real interest rate is positive but the value of the debt is positive and constant. In this case, the government will never be able to pay off all its debt. Secondly, the budget constraint will also be satisfied if the debt is growing but the growth rate of debt is less than the real interest rate. Actually, for the government budget constraint says that for fiscal sustainability, the government must be generating additional sources to repay the debt in each time period. the government must be able to generate some primary surpluses to offset its initial debt. This can be represented by rearranging the equation 1, which can be written as integral of t is equal to 0 to infinity e raised to power minus rt into tt minus gt into dt is greater than equal to d0. But we know that in dynamic economies, the government purchases are always increasing, and it is quite possible that it may be leading to changes in the size of the debt. The size of the debt in each time period will be increasing if the tax revenue is increasing at a slower rate than the government purchases, while it would be diminishing if the former is increasing at a faster rate than the latter. At each point of time, the government adds to its debt to the extent of the difference in its purchases and revenue plus the interest payments. Hence, delta dt is equal to gt minus tt plus rt into dt. This is also termed as primary deficit. Romer 1996 says that considering the primary deficit rather than the total deficit is a better way to measure the extent to which the fiscal policy is contributing to government's budget constraint. However, there are cases where the government is not exactly required to follow the budget constraint, especially when we introduce the present values in the constraint equation. The present values of the purchases, revenues, debts, etc. are not to be calculated at a single point of time, but several points of time in future. At any point of time, there are some individuals who are saving and some who are dissaving. This may induce the governments to run a Ponzi scheme, that is, it may repay the old debt and its interest by raising the new debt. With this policy, the value of debt outstanding grows at real interest rate. This policy does not satisfy the budget constraint, but still if the real rate of interest is less than the growth rate of the economy, the ratio of the value of debt to the size of the economy goes on falling, which gives the governments an adequate justification to follow this policy even if it is beyond the budget constraint. Now we will discuss the intertemporal budget constraint, fiscal deficit and the government debt. Traditionally, there are arguments for a balanced budget. Like a family finance, it is expected that the governments should spend as much as they earn. Pigou 1929 says that in normal times, the main part of a government revenue is required to meet regular expenditure that recurs year after year. There can be no question that in a well-ordered state, all such expenditure will be provided for out of taxation and not by borrowings. To meet it by borrowing would involve an ever-growing government debt and a corresponding ever-growing obligation of interest. But in practice, it is difficult to follow the strict rule of balanced budget. Borrowings have their own positive multiplier effects in terms of increasing aggregate demand and so pulling the economy out of pessimistic tendencies, while on the negative side, the borrowing sometimes show the wasteful expenditure on part of the government and hence the fiscal unsustainability with a number of negative consequences. Therefore, there is a tough choice between the missing of opportunities as a consequence of constraint of a balanced budget and instability and waste caused by its removal. The proponents of the budget deficit and debt accumulation say that the budget deficits and the debt accumulation can serve two purposes. They provide a means of redistributing income over time and across generations, and they serve as a means of minimizing the deadweight loss of taxation associated with provision of public goods and services. There is also an alternative view called Ricardian equivalence. According to this view, consumers are forward-looking and therefore base their spending decisions not only on their current income but also on their expected future incomes. The forward-looking consumers conceives the government borrowing today means a high tax rate in the future. A tax cut financed by the government debt does not reduce the tax burden, nor does it change the aggregate savings. It merely reschedules the collection of taxes from current time period to a date. This leaves the consumption unaffected. The households tend to save parts of their disposable income to pay the future tax liabilities. This increase in private savings is exactly equal to the fall in public savings due to tax cut in the current time period. Thus, the national savings, which are sum of private and public savings, remain the same. Thus, the tax cut today neither increases savings nor the consumption. However, this does not mean that all changes in fiscal policy are irrelevant. The tax cut today may increase the consumption expenditure if the consumers understand that the tax cut today is not going to increase the tax rate in future, and hence they feel richer and so increase their consumption. In any case, we can see that the budget constraint of the government for its revenue collections, expenditures and so fiscal deficits and savings is more of an intertemporal choice. Therefore, we must look at the intertemporal budget constraint, which is given below. It is GT minus TT plus IT into BT minus 1 is equal to delta BT plus delta MT is equal to minus ST, where G is government expenditure, T is tax revenue, B the government debt, M the monetary base, S is total budget surplus, and I is the interest rate on government debt. To have an exact estimate of the budget constraint, it is better to calculate the net market value of the debt, which is defined as the gross debt minus financial assets, which are further being expressed here as ratio of GDP. Small gt minus tau t plus it minus pi t minus nu t into bt minus 1 is equal to delta small bt plus delta small mt plus pi t plus nu t into mt minus 1 is equal to minus small st, where the lowercase letters, that is small g, tau, b, m and small s, denote the ratio of corresponding uppercase variables to nominal GDP given in previous equation. Pi t is the inflation rate and is equal to pt minus 1 divided by pt minus 1, and nu t, the growth rate of GDP, is equal to yt minus 1 divided by yt minus 1. P and y denoting price level and real GDP respectively. Equation 3 implies that the government deficit, including the interest payments, is financed by new bond issues, base money creation and seigniorage. This equation can also be rewritten as dt plus rho t into bt minus 1 is equal to delta bt. Here dt is equal to gt minus tau t minus delta mt minus pi t plus nt into mt minus 1 is the primary government deficit expressed as proportion of nominal GDP, and rho t is equal to it minus pi t minus nu t is the real ex post interest rate adjusted for real output growth. This equation can be further solved to express current debt to GDP ratio in terms of expected discounted future primary deficit over the next time periods. BT is equal to ET delta T and N into BT plus N minus ET summation of I is equal to 1 to N delta T and I into dt plus I, where delta Tn is the time varying real discount factor in coming n periods adjusted for real GDP rates and is defined as delta Tn is equal to a product of S is equal to 1 to N into 1 plus rho T plus S raised to power minus 1. Using these discounted factors, we can easily derive the discounted value of the debt GDP ratio, that is XT, and also the discounted value of the primary deficit GDP ratio, that is ZT, and can be expressed as XT is equal to ET into XT plus N minus ET summation I is equal to 1 to N into ZT plus I. And by using another discount factor alpha T, We can derive the government budget constraint with all intertemporal factors as Zt is equal to delta Xt. As discussed earlier, the fiscal sustainability is always desirable, especially when we are deviating from the view of strict implementation of the balanced budget policy, that is allowing fiscal deficit and government debt. The fiscal sustainability can be observed in a finite as well as infinite time horizon. Further, we discuss the fiscal sustainability in an infinite time horizon. If the time horizon goes to infinity, the necessary and sufficient condition for fiscal sustainability is that the expected debt GDP ratio converges to 0. This condition states that no debt is undertaken to meet the interest payments, neither do the government involves itself in any Ponzi game. Hence, limit n tends to infinity, Et into delta t plus n into Bt plus n is equal to 0. However, the current debt GDP ratio, that is Bt, is offset by the sum of current and expected future discounted surpluses expressed as a proportion of GDP. That is, Bt is equal to minus limit n tends to infinity Et summation of t is equal to 1 to n delta Ti into dt plus I. Thus, when the debt GDP ratio is discounted back to period 1, the transversality condition and the government intertemporal budget constraint can be expressed as limit n tends to infinity Et xt plus n is equal to 0, or xt is equal to minus limit n tends to infinity Et summation I is equal to 1 to n zt plus I. In principle, current debt can be sustainable by any sequence of primary deficits or surpluses if they offset the current level of debt. Thus, the necessary and sufficient condition for intertemporal budget constraint to hold is that the discounted debt to GDP ratio should be stationary. Moving on to the fiscal sustainability in a finite time horizon. In the medium term, the current fiscal policy can be said to be sustainable if it is able to achieve a targeted level of debt to GDP ratio which is non-zero. Denoting this desired level as B star, the intertemporal budget constraint becomes Bt minus Et into delta Tn, B star T plus n is equal to minus Et summation of I is equal to 1 to n delta dti into dt plus I. The left hand side of this equation shows the difference between the current debt GDP ratio and the expected value of the desired discounted ratio n periods ahead, thus showing the desired change in the discounted debt GDP ratio. The right hand side shows the flow of discounted future primary deficit or surplus to GDP ratio expected at time t. Thus, the current fiscal situation can be assumed to be sustainable if above equation is satisfied. Otherwise, the government has to change either its fiscal stance or the debt objective. If the government wishes to reduce its debt burden, the left side becomes positive, then to be sustainable. There will be a need to produce corresponding sequence of surpluses. A positive value of the left hand side can also be caused by a low discount ratio of a high discount rate due to high real interest rate or low growth. This results into lower present value of future debt GDP ratio as compared to its current value, and hence a tight fiscal policy will be necessary. A change in fiscal stance is possible through changes in tax rates, government purchases, or through money financing. If discounted surplus is insufficient to permit the desired reduction in discounted debt, then an increase in tax rate will be required to satisfy the intertemporal budget constraint. The change in average tax required will actually be the measure of fiscal pressure. The countries also have the tradition to follow a deficit ceiling. Unlike the debt ceilings, the deficit ceilings create a positive and persistent fiscal pressure on the governments, which have the tendency to last beyond the dates these limits are imposed. The deficit limit in the famous Maastricht Treaty is defined inclusive of interest payments on debt. To impose a deficit ceiling, we can calculate a debt to GDP ratio consistent with the budget constraint. This can be expressed as the outstanding stock of current debt in terms of the deficit inclusive of interest payments, that is HT, as BT is equal to HT plus 1 minus nu T plus pi T into BT minus 1. A ceiling on total deficits can be expressed by imposing a limiting value on HT. The Maastricht Treaty imposed this limit at 3%. This limit has forced all the governments across the world to adopt even more austere fiscal programs, even though they are following a sustainable fiscal policy. Let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. Traditionally, the economists have agreed upon a balanced budget, but later it was realized that following a rigid policy of balanced budget had its greater harms than the benefits. Therefore, instead of having a balanced budget, the government should focus upon the sustainability of the fiscal deficit as well as the government debt. High debt levels may discourage the use of the public budget as a stabilizing device for the economy due to concerns over the sustainability of debt. The sustainability issue is not actually related with a single point of time, but it expands over a period of time. Hence, it is important to analyze the sustainability of fiscal deficit and government debts with an intertemporal budget constraint. We can see that in an infinite time horizon, debt can be sustainable by any sequence of primary deficits or surpluses if they offset the current level of debt. Therefore, the necessary and sufficient condition for intertemporal budget constraint to hold is that the discounted debt to GDP ratio should be stationary. On the other hand, in a finite time horizon, the current fiscal situation can be assumed to be sustainable if it is able to achieve a targeted level of debt to GDP ratio, which is a non-zero, that is, if the desired change in the discounted debt to GDP ratio is just equal to the flow of discounted future primary deficit or surplus to the GDP ratio expected at time t given the intertemporal budget constraints. That's all with this module. Thank you.